Welcome and thank you for coming to Highland City Town Hall with Representative John Curtis, hosted by Highland Youth City Council. John R. Curtis proudly represents Utah's 3rd Congressional District, a district that includes Salt Lake, Utah, Emory, Carbon, San Juan, Grand, and Wasatch counties. Congressman Curtis serves on the Foreign Affairs, Natural Resources, and Small Business committees. He is known for his personal approach to government and has been named the #1 top elected official on social media by the government social media group and recognized by Forbes for his commitment to citizen engagement. Since being elected to Congress in November, Congressman Curtis's bill has become law. He's held more than 62 town halls and is reforming Congress one crazy pair of socks at a time.
We would like to recognize in attendance Highland City Mayor Rod Mann, members of the Highland and Alpine City Councils, Highland Youth City Council, Alpine Youth City Council, and residents of the Highland Alpine area. Thank you on behalf of the Highland City Youth Council to Mayor Mann, Highland City, and Alpine City for their contributions to this event.
Before we get started, we would like to outline the rules and regulations of this town hall. Representative Curtis will be given an unlimited amount of time to answer each question, which have been submitted via email, paper, or vocally. On certain occasions, follow-up questions may be asked by the audience. Please save your applause for the end of each response and show respect throughout the meeting.
We would now like to allow Representative Curtis to make some opening remarks, following which we will begin to introduce questions from the public.
Thank you. The very first question I have is, I got introduced, but they didn't, right? Can I ask you to take a few seconds each and tell us about yourself?
My name is Jacob Gertler. I'm on the Highland Youth City Council. I'm the government event chair, and so this is my job on the council is to plan this event. And luckily I had Laura and Julie and the rest of the council helping me. I live here in Highland. I go to American Fork High School, and I've lived in Highland for about a year.
I'm Laura Mabey. I'm the government chair, so I run all the things relating to government for Highland Youth City Council. I've been on Highland Youth City Council this is my 3rd year, and I've lived in Highland for 4 years, and I go to Lone Peak, and I'm a senior. So.
Yay, can we have it? Yes, thank you. And Mayor Mann, would you stand so we can recognize you as well? Thank you. And I will tell you my bias. The mayor is the most important job on the planet, and thank you for your service. And do you have city council members here we should introduce? Bert? Let's introduce our 2 candidates. Who's candidate? Would you stand and introduce yourselves, please? Hello.
I'm Elizabeth Luntz, and I'm running for House District 27.
My name is Brady Brammer. I'm running for House District 27. I'm the Republican candidate.
Hi guys, my name is Joe Bookman. I'm the Libertarian running for House District 27.
And Joe and I have a history. He ran for this seat a year and a half ago, and we got to know each other. And at least from my end, there's a great mutual respect. I hope it's mutual for each other, and really enjoyed that was good. Really enjoyed the Libertarian perspective. Are there other members of the City Youth Council that we should introduce here? Will you all stand if introduce yourselves? Stand, and then a lot of them? Okay, we'll give you just one big shout out. Thank you to all of you. All right, let's jump in. Let me maybe just start with sharing a few things with you, and then we'll jump right into the questions. I've done enough of these. They mentioned 60. I think we're close to 100 in 10 months. We think we're averaging about 10 a month. I had for a while, my staff was putting together 5 a week. I would come home from Washington, and like on a Thursday night, we'd do 2 on Friday and 3 on Saturday. Then we'd fly Monday to Washington. I will tell you that they are amazing for 2 reasons. One is I get to hear you and what's on your mind, and then I get to respond, and you get to hear what I'm thinking and why I'm doing certain things. And to me, there is no better format than this really, close face-to-face It's real accountability to me. If I go back to Washington and cast a silly vote and have to come back and look you all in the eye, to me that's real accountability. So I've really enjoyed these and find they're the best way to be in touch. This is probably, to be honest, the youngest overall age. Some of you are throwing the average off, but this is great, and I suspect we'll get a little different line of questioning, which I think will be really interesting today. I also have to just stop and give a shout out to Quinn Siemens. Quinn and I worked together a very long time ago, and I haven't seen him for many years. So Quinn, it's good to see you, and nice to be here with all of you. Well, let me give you a quick update, and then we'll jump into the questions. I've been in Utah this week, and we've just run from kind of appointment to appointment to appointment, meeting with businesses, meeting with individuals. It's really nice when we get back in the district and have a week. Some people kind of tease us a little bit and say, well, you're out of session in Washington, you hardly ever work. And if you talk to the congressman, we actually probably do more work back here because there's so many opportunities and people that we need to speak with and meet with, and they're really very enjoyable. Corey and I need to introduce Corey. Corey is back here standing up. Corey's my chief of staff and was my deputy. Yeah, he's clapping for himself. Good one, Corey. Corey was my deputy mayor for 8 years at Provo City, and he's come with me as my chief of staff. We'll fly back to Washington, D.C. on Monday. We've got kind of a fun day. Sunday night, we drive to Zion National Park. We're going to go a little bit early because we're going to take a hike Monday morning. 10 o'clock at Zion, we actually meet with the park director, and we have a bill in. I'm a co-sponsor of it, but Chairman Bishop is the main sponsor of it, to finally fund our national parks. We have this huge backlog in deferred maintenance. Tens of millions of dollars, and the bill actually funds that, which is a really important thing to do. If we're going to have the parks right, let's take care of them. We leave from that meeting, drive to St. George, hop on an airplane in St. George, fly to Salt Lake, and catch a flight out to Washington, D.C. Arrive in Washington, D.C. at 11:30 at night at Dulles Airport. And Tuesday is a really exciting day for me because I get to what they do, we call it manage the floor, which means they put me in charge of the bills that are coming before the House, and one of them is my bill. It's the fourth bill that will actually pass through the House. It's a simple little bill. I'm on the Small Business Committee, and it's a bill dealing with small business loans. There's some inconsistency in federal regulation, and this cleans it up. And it came to our attention from a small business owner here in Utah that brought it to our attention. So it's actually our fourth bill that will make it through the House. Really exciting in 10 months. Our last one is called the Rural Broadband Permitting Bill. One of the big emphasis of things that's really important to me is that we've got an amazing economy here, right, in Utah County, less than 3% unemployment. And if you drive just 90 miles away or less, we have double-digit unemployment in our rural parts of the district. 5 of my 7 counties are rural and are really struggling with economic development. And this bill eases the regulations for getting broadband into these locations. Right now, the permitting process can take 9 years. And you can see that's just not acceptable, and we don't have that long to wait. The bill right before that we passed, the House passed 50 opioid bills dealing with opioids. One of those was my bill. It's a simple bill. This will shock you. 1 out of 5 women are prescribed opioids in pregnancy. That sounds terrible. It gets worse because in Utah we double that average. And so my bill is just a real simple bill asking for a study to dig down into why, what's happening, and there are other things that we can be doing to manage the pain that they're experiencing. And the bill before that, my first bill, we call it the fish bill. It deals with endangered species in in the Colorado and San Juan rivers. In order to do any work in those rivers, the Endangered Species Act requires an offsetting mitigation project, and it just sets up that project. So people love it because no tax dollars are involved. It's good for the environment, and it's good for the economy. And those are the 4 bills that we've passed through the House, and we're going to try to get through the Senate. I mentioned the opioid bill. It's really kind of a really good example of when we work well together as a Congress. I had an opportunity to preside on the floor when some of these bills were coming through, and this was the dialogue that I heard. The Republicans get to stand up first because we're a majority and talk about the bill. And the Republicans would stand up and say, these are really great bills. I'd like to thank our Democrats on the other side of the aisle for their help in putting these bills together. And the Democrats would stand up and say, these are really great bills. I'd like to thank the Republicans for their help with these bills and putting them together. It's just the way you'd like us to do things. Does that make sense? Really good bills. They passed on a bipartisan basis, went over to the Senate. The Senate passed their version slightly different than ours. Now the two will come together and we have to make the two versions match. Now this is what's interesting. 50 bills on opioids. One of the largest problems we have in the country right now. I'm curious, did anybody hear anything about that? A couple of people. It's not what the press is reporting. You're not hearing when we function well. Guess what you hear about, right? All of our problems. And I'll give it to you, we have our problems, right? I mean, there's plenty to report on when we're not doing well. But I like to bring that up to show you that not all is dysfunctional back there, and we actually are getting some things done in a way that you would like us to do. Well, let's jump in and do the questions, shall we? Okay.
Okay, our first question is from John. He lives in Cedar Hills. He asks, the Constitution made the legislative branch co-equal with the executive and gives it oversight authority to make sure the president faithfully exercises their responsibilities. I understand the president is from your party, and you and I might disagree on what deserves oversight, but I think most people would agree that he does things that deserve oversight, especially if they are harmful to our nation, state, and district. However, I don't see the House doing their duty to oversee and act as a check against the executive. How do you and how will you use your authority to oversee the executive and look out for the people in our district?
I think there's a couple of examples that I can give you. Right now we have this Mueller investigation going on. It's kind of interesting because the Mueller investigation is actually done by the administration. It's not done by Congress. We have kind of a weird dynamic. When the president does something that people have a problem with, we can do an investigation as a Congress, and we did. It's conducted by Republicans, so it won't surprise you that we did our investigation and found no wrongdoing, right? Now there's a parallel investigation going on by the Attorney General, and that's what Mueller is doing. And I think it's very important that that investigation go on without outside influence, and so we have a little bit different viewpoint, right, other than what Congress came up with. But the real tool that Congress has as a check and a balance is legislation. That's our tool in our toolbox, is legislation. Let me give you a great example of Congress pushing back on President Trump. Right now, this may be a question that would come up tonight, is how do I feel about tariffs? I'm frequently asked that. I don't like them. I think they're a tax. I don't think that anybody wins a trade war. So one of the tools that Congress has to disagree with the president is to pass legislation. And so there is a bill in Congress right now, and I've co-sponsored it, that would take back the authority from the president to enact a tariff for national security. That's what he's using, as national security, to put these tariffs in place. And that takes that back to the Congress and puts us in charge of it. So it's kind of like my last example of opioids. We don't do a good job of explaining when we are pushing back. But John, I don't know if you're here, but that's one of the things I would, oh, there's John, okay. One of the things I would tell you is there are some examples I can show you of pushing back. I find that a lot of people in the district would like me to push back on the president's behavior. And my tools for doing that are different, right? I can tweet and I can express my differences, but I think the oversight of Congress is not necessarily to deal with personalities of the president. Good.
Awesome, thank you. Are there any follow-up questions for that response?
Yes. Right. So I think a lot of us would agree with you that it's a far stretch to say this is for our national security, and that's why Congress is saying, no, we think you've gone too far with this. We want that. We don't want you to have that authority, because we don't see the tie either. Got to be veto proof. Right. Well, I can tell you that I think every single Democrat would support it, and yeah, and I think there's a fair number of Republicans that would. So it may be. I don't know because we haven't gotten it to the floor for a vote. That's the hope, is it would be veto proof. If not, it is a pretty clear message. Yeah, and that's, you know, I'd share that with all of you. We do have tools, but they're not tools that are easy to use. You have to come up with a majority that's veto proof if you're going to take something back from the president.
Awesome, thank you. A resident named Eric from Highland asks, how do you feel about passing legislation that would require K-12 students to turn off their cell phones/mobile devices and turn them into their teachers at the beginning of each class?
So, this is an easy one. I think that this is a perfect question for a local school board. I would say it's not even really a state issue in my mind, that this would be a school board issue. Each school board has different circumstances and things that are important to them. And I think one of the things we don't want to do in Washington, D.C. is tell you locally how to handle classes and things like that. So take the easy way out and say local decision.
Our next question is from Josh. He lives in Highland. How would Mr. Curtis vote on potential legislation to regulate social media in light of efforts by tech companies to censor opinions and abrogate their internal morale?
Okay, so read that again. Okay.
How would Mr. Curtis vote on potential legislation to regulate social media in light of efforts by tech companies to censor opinions that abrogate their internal morale?
So this is a really interesting question. Let me try to give you some analogies to make it clear how I would answer this question. Imagine if, as your congressman, I decided that I didn't want you to send letters to people that you know, or I wanted to control the letters that you sent, or if I wanted to tell Federal Express that they couldn't pick up your letters if they wanted to. And so the point that I'm trying to point out, and I'm not sure I'm doing a good job of it, is government has to be really extremely careful when it says to a private business what they can do and what they can't do. And one of the things that people point out is that these social media platforms are now becoming so ubiquitous that, and I hear this comparison, that they're really like a utility. When we talk about net neutrality, this comes up a lot, that the internet is like a utility and therefore should be regulated like a utility. And I really struggle with that. You have a choice to use Facebook. You have a choice to use Snapchat. How many of you like Marco Polo? It is the best. You notice we're a little bit older, the ones of us that like Marco Polo. It's great for grandkids. If you're not talking to your grandkids on it, you need to check it out. But we have a choice to use that, and likewise, they have a choice to run the companies the way that they want. I think the biggest thing I would ask for of these social media companies is transparency. That they would be very clear with their policies, what they do and what they don't do, and then I would give them a lot of leeway to govern themselves, but I do believe that transparency is super important.
Awesome, well thank you. We've gone through our questions that we received through email, so I'm just going to hand the microphone to Brendan, and those of you who have other questions, if you'll just raise your hand and say your name and ask the question.
And I got to tell you, he has the hardest job here, because the worst thing I do at a town meeting is decide who I call on. So I'm glad it's you.
It's good to be able to ask you a question again.
Hey, Joe.
I loved our debates last year, and I'll just say in front of everyone here, thank you for serving so
Thank you.
professionally and leaning a little libertarian in my view from time to time. But you mentioned the Utah economy being solid, yet it's operating on top of $22 trillion in federal debt. that I don't see ever being repaid. I don't know if you do. And somewhere between 100 and 200 trillion in currently mandated but unfunded federal spending. At what point is the Republican Party, in your view, going to get serious about fiscal conservatism?
I think there are a couple of major moments in my 10 months of service that were disappointing. And one of those was seeing my Republican colleagues vote for a $300 billion spending bill. And primarily without an answer. It'd be one thing to vote for the bill and say, look, this is where the revenue is going to come from. In Utah, we have an amazing fiscally conservative philosophy. We don't spend money unless we have it. And that's what needs to happen on the federal level, but we're a long ways away from that. And it was disappointing to see Republicans who have championed fiscal conservatism forever and ever be the ones who expanded spending by so much. I believe the answer is that we need to be willing to make very, very hard decisions. And you mentioned the unfunded spending and the automatic spending that takes place. I don't mind telling you, I know there are a lot of you that are very young here, that one of the very first things we need to do is have a serious conversation with you about Social Security. It's headed for a train wreck, and we need to have a conversation with you about eligibility dates. And those are types of things that would help us repair this fiscal situation we're in. But there's very few people willing to have those tough conversations and be frank with them. And so that's something I hope to champion.
Why don't we raise the cap on Social Security?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying when we have a frank discussion with this group. I have 6 kids that are millennials, and they will live far longer than we anticipated when we put that. Oh, I'm sorry, you were referring to a different cap, aren't you? Okay, I'll address that, yeah. So I'll finish my point, even though it wasn't the answer to your question, was I think we need to be willing to say, hey, your retirement age when you're eligible needs to move back. I believe what you're referring to is that there is a dollar amount, and I forget exactly what it is, at which you cap out and don't pay Social Security after that. And I do believe that's also the same type of hard question we need to be willing to ask. And I find these are the types of questions that mayors ask and that the governor asks. And this is why we're fiscally conservative, because we're willing to ask those hard questions. You're mandated every year, and you don't get a choice. And therefore, you make hard decisions. This really hit cities in 2010 when the economy just tanked. In Provo City, we lost 8% of our revenue and had to ask hard questions and actually scale that budget back 8%. And those are really good, legitimate questions we need to ask.
I was at a meeting in Provo during the summer, and you brought up one of the causes that you feel really strongly about, helping migrant workers who are here temporarily. I got an email about you were going to put a panel together of people to talk about this, and I was just curious to hear how that's going. Any progress there at all?
I mentioned I've had a couple of very disappointing moments in Congress. One was the spending. The other was our inability to move the ball forward on immigration. We have come so very close a couple of times, and really felt like we had some good consensus going on. And then when it came down to a vote, it failed. There's a number of areas with immigration that are broken. One of those areas is the area of our seasonal workers, those who would like to come to our country, they'd like to come legally, they'd like to pay taxes, they'd like to work hard, and in many cases go home. And we've done a terrible job of making that possible. And at the same time, we have a number of our businesses here in Utah that are dependent on that labor, and they're really struggling because they can't get access to it. Right now, there is, if there is progress, it's small, but there is a bill. Chairman Goodlatte has sponsored a bill. I'm a co-sponsor of that. That would increase the limits and be more clear with eligibility and how people do that, and making that more of a possibility. We're struggling to get the support for that right now. We tried a couple of other things and didn't get the support, so we thought, okay, well, let's see if we can tackle this one. So I've seen us both do a couple of approaches on immigration. One is to try to go for massive overhaul, and the other is to try to take this a bite at a time. So far, we're struggling with both approaches. So we don't have a lot of good news to report, other than there is a bill. It's getting a number of co-sponsors with it right now. We'll see if we can get the momentum to get that to a vote.
Can you tell me what's on the bill specifically, or?
In general terms, yes. It increases the caps, the number of people that are eligible to come. It does put in E-Verify, and E-Verify is what our employers use to verify that somebody actually has gone through the proper steps to be here. What I hear from our agricultural community is we're happy to do E-Verify as long as there's an eligible pool that can qualify. So if you say, well, you must do E-Verify, and there just aren't people, then they're in real serious trouble. So increasing those caps is very, very important to get the right number of people into the country, and then they're willing to do E-Verify. So it's kind of a combination. E-Verify is a piece of what's needed to build the consensus to get this bill through.
John, remember the Bracero program? Are you all familiar with that, where workers from the South would come up agriculturally and have work permits to pay taxes, like you're referring to? But it was I think it was fairly successful because they came in legally. What's your opinion about reestablishing such a program where you allow migrant workers to come in under whatever program you want to call it, but it's all legal? And they would go back, but it worked.
That's exactly what this bill is.
I'm talking about prior to Cesar Chavez. For those of you who know of him, he did a fantastic job in a lot of ways. Farmers had a lot of crying tears at that time, but I think all in all it worked out okay. So can you address the issue about the Bracero?
I think this bill that I'm talking about is what we're trying to be the modern version of that, to give them a path where they can come legally, they can pay taxes, and then many of them want to return home when that happens. By the way, let's give preference by age here. The younger you are, let's give them the higher likelihood of giving the microphone.
Okay, great.
You're one
I'm
of the
30,
young ones,
so
yeah.
Do I still count as young?
Yeah.
I don't want any Social Security by the time I retire, by the way.
Okay.
I don't want any. So I kind of wanted you to help me understand the process that was gone through in order to pass the latest, not omnibus, but minibus, with the Department of Defense spending and the Health and Human Services spending combined. And Senator Lee tried to attach an amendment to that spending to defund Planned Parenthood, and it failed, barely. I'm wondering how that process was done in the House. Did we pass, I know we passed a separate bill for Department of Defense spending. Did we pass a separate one for Health and Human Services? Because I never saw that one actually passed through the House.
Yes, so.
And did that one have Planned Parenthood funding, and did you vote for it?
Let me take those one at a time and explain a little bit the appropriations process. When we're doing our job right, there are 12 appropriations that we make. And I say it that way because for a number of years, those appropriations have not made it all the way through the process. Now, the House will be quick to point out last year we did do 12 appropriations, and the Senate never brought them up, never even voted on them. And that's really frustrating because when we don't do this appropriation process, that's when you see us come into these shutdown modes. And you kind of get the gun to the head and say, you either shut down the government or you pass this large spending bill. I'd been in Congress just 3 months and had voted on 4 shutdown votes. And the government shut down twice in my first 3 months in Congress. Not a good way to run the government. I think we would all agree on that. And so this year, there's in the Senate, there's a new chairman of the appropriations, and he's working really well with the House. in a goal to get as many of these appropriation bills through as possible. So I would tell you that these bills that were put together as a mini omnibus did go through the committees. It went through the appropriations process the way that we would like them to, and then were sent over to the Senate. And I think that not perfect, but far better than we've been doing in years past. And these are the types of things, if we can get them through, keep us away from this shutdown mode. And now we still have a number of appropriations to get through, but you could see how much better it is if we did get into a shutdown vote to have already taken care of the military, right, and some of these other budgets. And now you're talking about a showdown on just pieces of the budget, which would be a whole lot different than a showdown on the whole thing. On Planned Parenthood, I can't tell you specifically because I didn't drill down that deep, but would be happy to look into that.
I would really like you to drill down in the future and never fund that again. I know it came back from the Senate after it was passed there, and then it went to the House again, but only in conference committee. But I'm guessing that that's not really your realm because that's only the leadership of the House. And then what kind of influence can you have at that point on a conference committee to say, we're not going to sign off on this Senate vote unless you
Well, conference
defund.
committee still needs to come back for a vote, and so that would be the influence I have at that point.
But did it come to the House for a vote after that?
I think it's coming.
Oh, okay. So it passed through the Senate. Everyone acted like it was going to the president's desk already.
If they changed what we did, then it has to come back for a vote. So depends on what happened in conference.
Okay, thank you.
Come on, we got to get some of you young ones asking questions.
Representative Curtis, after the Las Vegas shooting, you made the statement, we must outlaw any other device that converts a legal weapon into an illegal one. I called your office, asked your staffers what you meant by that. They couldn't tell me. Maybe you could.
Yeah, I feel, and let me give you my background. I mentioned worked with Quinn. Quinn and I designed, built, and installed shooting ranges. He's still doing it all over the world. And so I've spent a fair amount of time around firearms and around the industry. And I believe that if we've made something illegal and somebody invents a device that makes a legal gun illegal, that device should be illegal. That's what I meant by it. Now, President Obama, through executive order, has already taken care of that. And that's why you didn't see Congress act on that. I will. This mic goes in and out every once in a while. You've brought up, so let me talk about gun safety for a minute and share my thoughts with you on that. The Parkland shooting, the Florida shooting weighed heavily on everybody's minds, and in my opinion, I don't think that was exclusive to those who love the Second Amendment or those who don't, who, I'm not going to say don't love the Second Amendment, that's not appropriate, I'm sorry, but those who have different feelings about firearms. It's given me a great deal of thought about what we all should be doing and what our role is in this situation. And what I'd like you to all think about in your mind for a minute is a big giant spreadsheet up here. And help me fill in the spreadsheet for a minute. And if you come down the column, the side of the spreadsheet, I'd put firearms, I'd put mental illness, I'd put school security, and then, for the lack of a better term, just another category down here. And then across the top, I'd put federal government, state government, county government, cities, school boards, families, communities, churches, HOAs, and this list can go that direction almost forever, right? And I believe it's a mistake if we simply look to one of those columns, either on going either axis, to say this is how we're going to solve gun safety. For instance, if we say, look, the only way we fix this is for the federal government to pass laws about guns. I think that's a huge mistake. I think it's a huge mistake if we say the only way we're going to fix this is for the federal government to pass laws. I think the way that we improve this situation is to put checks in every box all the way across and all the way down. I think we all have a responsibility in this. I think in our homes we have a responsibility. and in our schools and in the federal government, we all have responsibilities. So let me talk for just a minute about the federal government and what we have done and what we're doing with our boxes along there, and then invite all of you, those that are running for state office and our mayors and anybody here from the school, to think themselves about what they can be doing in their boxes. I'll divert for just a minute and tell you that I'm very familiar with the Provo School District, and they have a lot of boxes they can check. They've just rebuilt 5 schools, and those schools are all built with safety in mind. Right now, if you arrive at the school after things, you have to go through a door that takes you right through the office. Nobody gets into the school after the bell rings that shouldn't be there. It's a great safety device. We have, and I don't think this is exclusive to the Provo School District, we have Hope Squads throughout our state. Are any of you involved in Hope Squads? They're amazing, aren't they? Peer on peer, looking out for each other. And when you see somebody in trouble, getting them resources and being a friend to them, it's an amazing thing. We have the Safe UT app. You guys are probably familiar with that. Cool. And that's what I mean by some great boxes checked by our school districts and the things that they're doing. The federal government has done several things. There was a major flaw in background checks, and we've taken a swing at fixing that. Right now, if you go back to the Texas church shooting, an individual was able to buy a firearm because the background check didn't have information from the Air Force that would have precluded him from buying firearms. And so that hopefully fixed that problem of agencies loading their data into the database, and that was one of the things that we've done. There's a bill right now that is on the House, that's in the House. I'm an original author and co-sponsor of the bill. If you look at what happened in Florida, it's one of the most tragic things that you can imagine. An individual who everybody knew should not have had a firearm, had a firearm. An individual who had openly threatened to kill himself and other people was allowed to obtain a firearm. You have to be pretty callous, and there are some who have told me this, that they don't see a problem with that, but you have to be pretty callous, in my opinion, to say, yeah, we shouldn't have put some restrictions on that individual buying a firearm. In Florida, there are already laws that would prohibit him from buying a firearm. And so you have to ask the question, why weren't they used? Why not? The answer to that question, in my opinion, is they would have had to charge him with a felony. Now think about what happens when we charge a teenager with a felony. If we're not careful and that stays on their record, the rest of their life they struggle with employment. Right? It's a blemish that it carries with them their whole life. So you can see why law enforcement would be hesitant to use the tool that they have to restrict a firearm in that particular situation. So there's been a lot of discussion, even some here in the state, about a tool that's called a gun violence restraining order. Somebody that is proven to be a threat to themselves and to other people can have a restraining order invoked on them that would keep them from purchasing or having a firearm. It's a nice little tool as long as there's proper due process in deciding whether or not they should have that firearm. And so right now we've introduced a bill that we believe has that proper due process and does give law enforcement a tool to take away a firearm when somebody has been proven to be a threat to themselves or to other people. There are about 4 states that already have this law, and those who have it tell me it saves thousands of lives, mostly suicides, and they really like it. Indiana is one of those. It's a very Republican state. It passed their state legislature on a near unanimous vote. This has actually a tougher due process, and what the bill does is it does not put this into law. It simply incentivizes states to do it. The reason for that is if it's a federal law, you have to go to a federal judge to get that restraining order, which would be a very high bar and difficult to do. So it's suggested that states take a look at this. And I believe that would be a major box checked in the states' boxes if they were able to find a path forward on something like this. That was a very long answer to your question. I hope it gave you the answer.
Just to go back to my original question, what did you actually mean? What devices would you ban?
Bump stocks.
Bump stocks do not convert a rifle into an illegal one.
Well, you and I can differ on that, and we do.
They are currently legal.
Okay. You and I will differ on that.
Well, they are currently legal by the law. I have one.
Okay. I understand what you're telling me. I'm also telling you President Trump put an executive order.
No, he did not. He instructed the ATF
right.
to look into banning it. The ATF asked for submissions. I submitted a submission along with a lot of other people. The ATF has not made a decision as of yet.
Okay, fair enough. Do we not have anybody under 25 with a question?
You're in luck. You're in luck. I am.
Yeah, times two.
Listen, John, I got so excited when I found out you were coming to Highland. We love you here in Highland. I love you personally.
Thank you.
I would say to all you young people here who are aspiring, John is the shining example of what to aspire to and how to do it well.
He is not a plant. Thank you, Quinn.
I'm really not. I'm really not. And the purpose of me standing up wasn't just to profess my love to you. That just kind of happened spontaneously.
Okay, thanks.
So we'll get to.
Now he's going to ask me a hard question.
Not hard. Actually, so my daughter goes to AF High School, Grace, and she takes a current issues class, and she comes home and talks about things that are going on in the news. And the other day she asked me, well, we talked about something that was happening in the news or something that was being reported in the news, and she said, is that fake news? Somebody said that was fake news. So is there, I guess the question is, I kind of explained to her this notion of fake news and why it's even a term. But yeah, I'm sorry. Talking about fake news, my daughter has a current issues class, and she asked that question about whether or not this story that we were talking about is fake news. So I don't want to get too controversial, and I don't know if I keep it light here, but do you feel like in your interactions with the media, you hear a lot about deep state. Is there, in terms of undermining the Republican foundation in Washington and giving favorable or favoritism to more the liberal side of the House, is there any merit to that, or is it just kind of something that's fun to talk about for the media?
First of all, for me to accept that Grace is in high school is near impossible.
It's true. She's a sophomore.
Wow.
You know Grace.
Wow. Let me answer your question in kind of an indirect way. How many of you have ever had an article written about you in a newspaper? Okay, raise your hand if it was 100% accurate. 90, yeah. And my point is that I think even the most well-intentioned press is not going to get everything right. And now add into that political agendas, and whether they're individual or of a particular broadcasting network or newspaper, and you can see the potential for information that is less than accurate. And as a guy who has a lot of articles written about him, I can tell you that I just stop reading them because they drive me crazy. Not that they are wildly off, but they're off enough that I just say, this is crazy. So if you turn on, I'm on airplanes a lot, and almost all of my flights have a choice between Fox News and CNN. So I have a little game I play, right? I watch Fox for a minute, and I flip over to CNN for a minute, and then I watch Fox for a minute, and I flip over to CNN for a minute. Do I think either of those are highly accurate? Let me rephrase that. I believe both of those are highly influenced by political perspectives. And unfortunately, the news has changed from reporting news to reporting opinions of the news. And that's what we see. We see panel after panel, right, giving their opinion of the news and not reporting the news. So if you, like I say, I'm not picking on Fox, I'm not picking on CNN, it happens on both of them. You turn it on and what do you see? 3 experts talking about Kavanaugh and this incident in high school. And every single one of them is giving you their opinion. They're not giving you the facts, they're giving you their opinion. And I believe one of the things that would be good for all of us, whether you're in political office or running for office or just going to high school, is to read things with a little bit of suspicion and to validate through multiple sources the things that are important. You can't do that with everything, right? But a situation that really is fundamentally important, I think you should spend the time, and there are lots of news sources out there, and I think if you explore them, you'll soon find some that you trust and that are not as heavily influenced. And I find I don't really understand an issue until I've listened to multiple views and multiple reportings of that. So call that fake news. Now you mentioned like deep state. I don't know myself where to go with that. I hear that a lot, and I'm trying to dig down into that myself and see how legitimate that is. All right, let's mandate at least one. Here's one right here. Under the age of like Quinn's age.
What can people like my age, our age, do like as far as government? How can we be like more like active and participating, I suppose, in government?
I love that question. You're here tonight. That's thumbs up to all of you for being here tonight. Many of you are on the council. What do we call it? The Youth Council. Thumbs up to that. That's a great thing. I'm going to give you a suggestion that I really, really like, and I think would make a substantial difference for you. We're 50-something days away from an election. I would pick, there's 3 of them here tonight, 3 different parties represented here tonight. It doesn't necessarily have to be their race. I would pick a race, and I would pick a candidate, and I would call them tomorrow and say, can I volunteer for your campaign? And you will have a very unique experience. And I wouldn't, if they don't take you seriously, call somebody else, right? Am I fair in saying you'd love to have some of these guys help you out? So there's lots of races going on in the state right now. We have state Senate, state House seats up. We've got these federal seats up for election. I would love to have you volunteer for a campaign, and a couple of things will happen. You'll get right deep down into a campaign. You'll get to know the candidate in a way you wouldn't otherwise get to know them. You'll start understanding issues and seeing issues in a way that you wouldn't otherwise see them. And then if they win, if you pick the right one, you kind of get to follow them, right? And you get to, they know you and they see you on the street and you get, does that make sense? So I think that's just a fantastic way to do a deep dive into politics and see the parts you like and meet people. And I think you'll find that you'll build some relationships, both with the candidate and other people that volunteer that will last you many years.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, how many of you kids have a journalism class? You guys take journalism? I'm a journalist, and there are ways to increase your literacy about when you read news, you know, like looking for sources and to independent sources and things like that. So you can actually get better at detecting whether you're reading something that's true or unsubstantiated.
Regarding the Kavanaugh appointment, we've all seen how the president values personal loyalty, not necessarily loyalty to the United States, but personal loyalty, and we've seen it from Comey, Sessions, all the way down to Omarosa, believe it or not. So, do you think that Justice Kavanaugh should possibly recuse himself from anything regarding the Mueller probe? And if so, if yes or no, why?
I guess I'm going to ask you a couple questions. One is, what do you see as potential involvement? I'm assuming you're saying if he's appointed to the Supreme Court.
If he's appointed to the Supreme Court, and assuming that the whole probe leads to a possible impeachment, do you think that Kavanaugh should recuse himself from any decisions regarding that?
I don't see why he should. Maybe you can help me see that, but I don't see the connection.
I saw a lot during his session in front of the Senate, I saw a lot of humming and hawing about, oh, well, I don't want to talk about a hypothetical case that may be coming up. And I saw him leaving a lot of doors open for himself.
I think that's not unusual in the nomination of a Supreme Court nominee. I think that follows a pattern. I think that you go through the proper process, and I think it would, in my opinion, it would actually be a derelict of duty to recuse himself. I think that's what we're sending him there to do, and he needs to step up and make the right decision. Okay, let's go every other one. Come on, we got anybody? You guys have to have questions. Okay.
I have a question regarding the lack of civility on the part of a lot of legislators and Congress people. They're just out there lambasting just about everybody. Is there any discussion back in Washington about sanctioning some of these people that are saying such dastardly things? It's just like outrageous.
Let me share a thought with you that I find people don't like. When I was mayor, Mayor Mann will appreciate this, every once in a while I'd get a grumpy crowd. We might be putting an apartment complex in their backyard or a road in their backyard. Mayors have to do hard things, right? And when they were grumpy with me, I used to like to look them in the eye and say, I have really bad news for you. If you don't like me, I am a reflection of you. So think about that for a minute. Our elected leaders are a reflection of us. And I think one of the things that needs to happen right now is that we have to take a really hard look in the mirror at ourselves. We all want our politicians to be better, and yet they're a reflection of us. And so just something to think about. There really is no move underfoot to sanction. Bad behavior is, in my opinion, not sanctionable. Being rude is not. I find it unappealing myself. I would agree with most of you that we're right in the thick of some of the least pleasing dialogue that we've seen in my lifetime. And I also will give you a little bit of hope, and that is I believe our system of government self-corrects. And I remember a newspaper reporter came up to me right after our debate, the one when we were all on the stage and I had a nose. Do you remember that? I don't know if you remember that. And they came up to me, they stuck the microphone under my nose and they said, "It's terrible, isn't it? It's never been this bad." And I stepped back and I said, "Really? Do you remember the Civil War?" Right? I mean, and we self-corrected through that. Right, and that's one of the beauties of our government is we correct. But you want to trade? Let's trade. Let's use that one for them and make them speak in the spotty microphone. Okay, let's try that for a minute. Is that okay? Going to say is the more you're involved, the quicker we will self-correct. Joel can wait. Go right here. No. Hold that right up tight so they can hear you. Yeah. Oh, it's not working. I'll repeat the question. How's that? Is that good? Okay, was there a second part of that? Okay. Question is, how did I feel about the Bears Ears Monument? Imagine this. I had been in Congress 3 weeks. President of the United States announced that he was coming to my district to repeal Antiquities Act designation, never done before by a president, that President Obama had put into place. And I don't know the exact numbers, but let's just assume for a minute that half the people were tickled to death and pleased, and half of them were angry at this. And I believe myself that the Antiquities Act is probably the worst way to deal with public lands, because it's unilateral, and it's the one piece of our government, there's very few pieces like this, that doesn't take multiple branches or multiple balancing to get something done. The president can unilaterally do that. That's going to make people mad, right? What I think is a far better answer is legislation. That we come together as a Congress, that we bring the stakeholders together, and that we find an answer that works for the American people with consensus. I've tried to do that in Bears Ears, and I don't mind telling you, it is gnarly. It is a landscape full of grenades and people who don't want to come together to find consensus. They are just lined up on their two sides, and they don't want to come together, so it's very difficult. But I will tell you something very encouraging. Emory County, right next to San Juan County, has been working for decades on legislation, meeting with stakeholders, and they have many diverse groups who have come together and found consensus on how we should deal with the public lands in Emory County. We have off-road enthusiasts, we have environmentalists, we have ranchers, we have recreationalists that have come together, and we're putting forward a proposal in Congress next week that will represent 1 million acres of conservation, but it's done through the legislative process where we have to get agreement from all sides. I'm really proud that the co-sponsor of my bill is the ranking Democrat member of the Committee of Jurisdiction. Now, there were a lot of words there, so let me tell you what that means. It goes through the Committee Natural Resources Subcommittee. On that, you have a chair and a ranking member. The chair is a Republican, the ranking member is a Democrat. That ranking member, Democrat, has co-sponsored the bill. So we've worked really hard. Now, there are those who disagree with the bill. You're always going to have that right. I'm not here to say that everybody agrees with it, but it has amazing consensus, and that's what I'd like to see us do with public lands. Did you want to? Yeah, the question was, how do I feel? What's the likelihood that the midterm elections will change the majority from Republicans to Democrats? All of us are guessing, right? There's moments when I say, oh, Republicans will keep this, and then we'll do a huge unforced error, right? And we've done a lot of them. And I say, man, I think the Democrats are going to take this. It's probably going to be right down to the wire. And I think what everybody agrees with is if Republicans keep it, we won't have as large of majority as we have now. And that does change the dynamics. It forces more bipartisan work if that happens. Cool.
Okay, just number one, thank you for your help with the national parks and the funding for the backlogged maintenance and things done. But again, I think that we need to value them, to work on the silos that the different departments work in, the Department of Interior and whoever, all these different departments that things fall under, and get them so they're talking to each other so these things don't happen. Maybe you could expound a little bit on what your trip to Southern Utah and how you're going to work with Bishop and where that is in the process of getting passed, because I know then it has to go to the Senate and all the other things.
So I mentioned early on what I was doing Monday, going to Zion Park, and we're meeting with the park director down there. Right now, a lot of people in the United States don't really realize this. You do because of your business. Joel is the director of, give me the title, President of Utah Valley Convention. You see why I had a hard time repeating it. So he's in tune with this. But we have a backlog of I wish I could, do you remember the number? I can't remember off the top of my head. It's hundreds of millions of dollars in deferred maintenance in our national parks. That's not good. When you, as a mayor, when you hear the word deferred maintenance, you say in your mind is that's going to cost us more money if we don't take care of it now, because deferred maintenance gets worse and worse. So if you don't crack and seal a parking lot out there, it'll cost you a whole lot more money than if you had fixed it right up front. And that's what's happening in our national parks. So there is a source of revenue that is set aside, and it's when we do any oil extraction in the United States, a portion of that goes into a fund. And so we're simply taking that money, it's not new taxes at all, and dedicating it to the national parks to clear up that backlog. And so it's a good fiscally responsible thing to do. And we're hoping that we can get that bill through. It was also a bipartisan bill, and that gives it a high likelihood of getting through the House and then through the Senate. Hi. I don't think we don't have a mic, so just say it nice and loud, and then I'll repeat it.
My son is the regional director out of Las Vegas for ATF. He spent several weeks in Washington, D.C. at their request. One of the reasons is his home is 3.5 miles from the incident that occurred there. And there's going to be action. There has to be. But a lot of the things, the clips this individual had, were custom made. They weren't manufactured as something that can be controlled. They were very expensive to buy, and they were asked for by the individual who used them. The other end of that is that the national incident system in the United States works well. My daughter-in-law was really impressed that surgeons were flying into Las Vegas as fast as the planes could carry them there. That's part of what is good in the way the national system works for us. To my request, national parks. We have a small one here in American Fort Canyon, and Forest Service and National Park Service together bought about 30 acres of property on the south side of SR 92. It hasn't got much traction in the last few years with budget the way it is, but we'd certainly like to have you look into that and see if some of the problems in American Fort Canyon be solved, because we could run a shuttle bus up to the facilities there that would be helpful. Question on just the fire situation. I know Senate candidate Romney has indicated that we need to do or look at doing things differently than we have currently been doing them. I tend to agree. I think there's been a lot of potential programs that have been ran. They don't work really well, and we need to look at things that don't let the whole country burn.
Let's talk about the fires for a minute, and also kind of get your mind thinking that we're getting close. So those of you that have questions, especially if you're under 25, don't wait too much longer, because we'll start winding down in a few minutes. But let's talk about the fires from a lot of perspectives. And by the way, I think the best thing for me to do is go tour American Fort Canyon with all of you. Let's go take an afternoon and do that. And absolutely. Several weeks ago, two fires actually started with a lightning strike. And the Forest Service made some decisions about how those fires would be managed. Now, I'm careful with my wording, because I had a very interesting conversation with some of the firefighters up there. And if you say, well, they made a decision to let that fire burn, all the firemen get this scowl on their face and say, all fires are managed. But you do make decisions about the amount of suppression that you're going to put on a fire. So I think it's very important to understand that the fire was managed, and some decisions were made about how much suppression to use on the fire. When they make those decisions, they have to factor in all sorts of variables. How dangerous is it to send firefighters out there? What resources do we use? Do we pull them off other fires to bring them to this fire? And so it's really easy in hindsight now for all of us to look back and say, you know what? We made a mistake. And I think the Forest Service would actually be the very first to tell you that they wish they would have done it differently. These fires got out of control, and we're now over 100,000 acres, and serious threat to property, and not small amounts of property. We have thousands of people that have been evacuated from their homes, and this is a very, very serious fire. We also have to go back upstream years and look at some of the decisions that were made years ago. And some of those decisions included not harvesting the wood out of these fires, especially like the beetle kill and things like that. The Forest Service will also tell you that they have started to change that decision, but they have a major problem in that all the sawmills have gone out of business. And so they actually tried to let contracts last year to clean out some of this, and nobody bid on them. And so we go back to the decision, right, originally to stop doing it when these places went out of business, and say this is not something you can flip a switch and change a policy on, because even though the policy's changed, we still have people not willing to come in and fill these contracts. Tomorrow afternoon, we have a meeting in my Provo office with all the South County mayors, the Utah County commissioners, Forest Service, BLM, like every agency we could think of. And we're going to sit down and start a real deep discussion about, A, what do we do the moment those fires are out, because now we have some serious landslide issues, and B, what do we do about future policy decisions? What can we learn from this to be better into the future?
So, well, okay, sorry. With your support of the national parks, would that also add on to the Utah debt with the supporting planting and working on landscaping?
Great question. I'm glad you're worried about it. This comes from an existing funding source, so there would be no additional taxes or no additional debt with it.
Okay.
He's got the power right there. Look, wave him down, yeah. Let's do this now. Let's see. If you're under 25 and you have a question left, raise your hand. Okay, so let's go here. No, go ahead first, but then we'll go here, here, and here for our last question, the last three of you. Is that okay with everybody? Good.
I just wanted to go back briefly to the gun legislation and some of the thoughts there. I'm a forensic psychologist. I work in mental health. That's my job. I've spent a lot of time evaluating people and making decisions and recommendations with the court on their personal liberties and whether or not those liberties can be restricted based on their mental health and their status. Obviously, it's a super tricky issue, hands down, and that's one of those many boxes that you listed that's going to have to be checked and addressed at some point. But I think my concern, even as a mental health professional, is that a lot of times the knee-jerk reaction is, especially when there is a link to mental health, and some may say there's always a link to mental health, but when there is, that the knee-jerk reaction is a restriction of rights. It's quite the dilemma in terms of where we draw the line on that restriction of rights and liberties. You know, we have some case law that we use when we have to make recommendations to the court system if somebody walks in my office and is dangerous. Lately, young adult males, right, they tend to be fitting a lot of the profile. And I can't just say, well, this kid right here, he looks like he could be a problem, and so we need to restrict his rights. There have to be some pretty specific, he just has long hair, but I don't think we should restrict his rights for that. But there have to be some pretty specific things in place to be able to address that. And a lot of times the legislature, I don't think, catches the entire point with that argument and what we need to do in terms of those restrictions. And Tarasoff is one case that we've lived by for decades now in terms of making those decisions, but there's got to be a fine line. I don't pretend to assess anybody's mental health here in the room, but people say, well, medications or particular diagnoses. Well, does that mean if you've ever taken a medication, if you've ever had a particular diagnosis? The water gets very, very muddy there, and we have a lot of actuarial data that we use on people that have actually offended. So when the court asks me and says, what's the risk that Brian here is going to reoffend? First of all, that means he has to have offended in the first place, so that puts him in a different category, and we hope that's not true, right? But besides that, we have to then say, well, yes, based on this data, here's what we have. We don't have the same kind of data for these people that are showing up in these incidents that have actually never been convicted of an offense. They're not on our radar in the same way. Doesn't mean that they shouldn't be, but it obviously makes it very tricky. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Good. I'll comment quickly, and then let's answer these questions. I think it's super important to realize that we're not talking about suspicions, right, where we could deny rights. We're talking about actual evidence that somebody is a threat to themselves or other people, and a proper due process by qualified people to decide that. And that's one of the reasons that didn't get traction in the state legislature this last year, is they didn't feel like that was adequate enough. Okay, let's go to our 3 last questions here.
Many have suggested, in light of the recent fires, that part of the cause of these fires is due to human-caused climate change. Where do you stand on increasing regulation on the energy industry to reduce carbon emissions?
We need a half hour just for that one. I'll try to give you a shorter answer. I personally think there's no question that these fires are influenced by climate change. That's not really a long debate. It is a much longer debate about carbon's influence in that role and man's influence in that role. I'd rather take an approach of, and rather than trying to prove that or disprove that, I think a real valuable conversation we can have here in Utah is, what are our responsibilities to be good stewards of the earth? And are we meeting those? And I think that's a value of this district, is we want to be good stewards. How many of you were Boy Scouts and got taught, leave your campground better than you found it, right? That's a Utah value. And are we leaving this earth better than we found it? I find that a dialogue like that goes a lot further than trying to determine who's causing it. Interestingly, I actually believe that personal responsibility plays a much larger role in this than we're giving it credit for. Let me give you an example. How many of you go to church as a family in more than one automobile? You don't have to raise your hands, right? Yeah, we just know you're all guilty, right? How many of you go to church in 2 or 3 automobiles, right? Right. Well, if we're not willing to understand that the inconvenience of walking to church, literally, right, 2 blocks away, is part of our responsibility in leaving this earth better than we found it, then how can we expect big corporations to care? And so I think one of the places this starts is with all of us and just our own behaviors. How many of you are using LED bulbs in your home? Yeah, thank you. Didn't mean for you to raise your hands, but I think it's a thoughtful question to ask ourselves. How many of you walk, right, when it's a reasonable distance? And, you know, I don't mind saying that I really struggle with my kids getting them to ride a bike. At some point, they'll grow up and realize it's cool to ride a bike, right? But so those are the things I'd like to see us do.
Okay, so we've seen major healthcare providers in the state of Utah come out with an ambitious goal in saying that they're going to cut their opioid usage by 40%. Do you believe this is something that could be reflected across the state and even the country?
Absolutely. I believe we need to ask a lot of hard questions about opioid use when we're using them. I will acknowledge, and some of you probably know people with chronic pain, there's a really appropriate place for opioids. And I think we need to be careful in our restrictions that in those appropriate cases that we're not taking that very important thing away from them. But I will also tell you, most of us know a story of somebody that goes in for a one-time use, a first-time use, and they're prescribed 140 tablets, right? And I think we need to be rethinking that. And it's probably a bad example because that implies that our doctors are being less than careful, and I think they're being fabulous with it. But I think there's questions like that we need to be asking about opioid use and prescription. Are we using them in the right times and places? What else is available to manage pain? And are we looking close enough at those other alternatives?
What is your opinion on medical marijuana?
Yeah. My opinion is that this is a state decision. How's that? I really believe that. Now, that being said, I will tell you that the federal government has blown it. We really have blown it. I don't believe the state has the information it needs to make a good decision, primarily because of the federal government. You scheduled one, if you don't know what that is, we're basically saying you can't study this drug legally. And not only that, we're going to impede any attempts of studying this drug. And as a result, we don't really have data about dosage, and we just don't have the data that we need. So I'd like to see the federal government, first and foremost, get out of the way And then I'd like to see this be a state decision, and that the states have as much information as possible so that they can make a good decision. Well, that's fabulous. You guys have been amazing. Appreciate you, Mayor. Yes. Oh. Can we just give a shout out to the whole Youth Council? Thank you very much for organizing this.
I want to give a shout out to John because I want to give a shout out to you because you do a great job at these events, and I really appreciate your service. The Youth Council has a gift.
So we're really grateful to plan this event and to be able to bring John Curtis here to talk to all of you. And we are so grateful for your contribution to our community and to our country. And we would just like to give you a big shout out for your contribution to Provo as mayor and to our district as our federal representative. And thank you so much for joining us tonight for this town hall.
Clearly, this is the best town hall meeting I've ever had, and I've never been given a gift like this. And what I was pointing to, if you couldn't tell, is there are a pair of socks hanging out the edge of this basket. So thank you very much.
So I have a gift from Highland City to you. This is a book called Majesty of Calmness, probably something that would be beneficial from time to time. It's a great book, and hope you enjoy it.